Marcus Sterling had served the Royal Guard of Valdoria for 15 years, and in all that time, he had never broken a single rule. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestioned, and his dedication to the crown absolute. That was until the night everything changed at Thornwick Manor. The sprawling estate sat on the edge of the kingdom, surrounded by ancient oak trees and rolling hills that stretched toward the distant mountains. It had been the private residence of Lady Cordelia, widow of the late King Alexander, for nearly 3 years since his passing. The manor was grand but somber, with its stone walls and tall windows that seemed to watch over the countryside like silent guardians. Marcus received the unusual assignment on a cold Tuesday morning in October. Captain Reynolds, a gruff man with silver hair and weathered hands, called him into his office at the Royal Barracks. The room smelled of leather and old parchment, with maps of the kingdom covering the walls and a large wooden desk that had seen decades of service. "Sterling, I have a special task for you," Reynolds said, not looking up from the papers scattered across his desk. "Lady Cordelia has requested additional security at Thornwick Manor. There have been some concerning incidents lately." "My." Marcus straightened in his chair. "What kind of incidents, sir?" "Strange noises at night, items going missing, and yesterday she found footprints in her private garden that didn't belong to any of the household staff." Reynolds finally looked up, his gray eyes serious. "She's convinced someone has been trying to get into the manor." The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Marcus was to spend the next week at Thornwick Manor, conducting security sweeps and ensuring Lady Cordelia's safety. He had met her only once before, during King Alexander's funeral, and remembered her as a graceful woman with kind eyes and an air of quiet strength that had helped the kingdom through its darkest hour. Marcus arrived at the manor just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The estate was even more impressive up close, with its carved stone entrance and meticulously maintained gardens. Lady Cordelia greeted him at the front door, dressed in a simple blue gown that complemented her auburn hair. She was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with an intelligence in her green eyes that suggested she was far more observant than most people realized. "Captain Sterling, thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand. "I know this might seem like an overreaction, but I truly believe something is not right here." Marcus bowed slightly. "It's Sergeant Sterling, my lady, and there's no need to apologize. Your safety is our primary concern." She led him through the manor, pointing out the various rooms and explaining the layout. The interior was a mixture of old and new, with ancient tapestries hanging alongside more modern furnishings. Family portraits lined the walls, showing generations of Valdorian nobility with their stern faces and elaborate clothing. Marcus noticed that many of the more recent portraits featured King Alexander, a tall man with kind eyes and a gentle smile that had made him beloved by his people. "The incident started about 2 months ago," Lady Cordelia explained as they walked through the main hall. "At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, but then things began disappearing from my private study." "What kinds of things?" "Small items mostly. A silver letter opener, some old books, a few pieces of jewelry that belonged to—" She paused, her voice catching slightly. "That belonged to my late husband." Marcus made notes in his small leather journal as they continued the tour. The manor was larger than it appeared from outside, with 3 floors and countless rooms that ranged from formal dining areas to cozy reading nooks. Lady Cordelia's private study was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the gardens. It was a warm room filled with books, comfortable chairs, and a large desk where she apparently spent much of her time. "This is where most of the items went missing," she said, gesturing around the room. "I keep everything exactly where I place it, so I notice immediately when something is gone." Marcus examined the windows and checked the locks, but everything seemed secure. The glass was thick and the frames were solid, showing no signs of forced entry. He made a note to have the grounds thoroughly searched in the morning. That night, Marcus took up his position in the main hall, where he had a clear view of the front entrance and the staircase leading to the upper floors. Lady Cordelia had retired to her chambers around 10 o'clock, leaving him alone with the servants who lived in the manor's east wing. The building was quiet, except for the occasional creak of old wood and the soft whistle of wind through the trees outside. Around midnight, Marcus heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from somewhere above. He moved silently up the staircase, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of Lady Cordelia's study, but when he reached the hallway, everything was silent. He checked the study door and found it locked. Just as it had been earlier, Marcus continued his patrol, checking every room on the second floor. In the portrait gallery, moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. As he walked past the paintings, something caught his eye. One of the portraits, showing King Alexander in his royal robes, seemed to be hanging slightly crooked. It was a small detail that most people would miss. But Marcus had been trained to notice such things. He approached the portrait and gently straightened it. But as he did so, he heard a soft click. The painting swung inward like a door, revealing a narrow passage behind it. Marcus felt his heart begin to race. This was definitely not something Lady Cordelia had mentioned during their tour. The passage was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for one person. Marcus lit a small lantern he carried and stepped inside. The walls were rough stone, and the air smelled of dust and age. After walking for several minutes, the passage opened into a small, circular room that appeared to be hidden within the manor's walls. The room was remarkable. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, scrolls, and various objects that glinted in the lantern light. In the center sat a heavy wooden table, covered with papers and maps. As Marcus moved closer, he could see that many of the items bore the royal seal of Valdoria. These were official documents, some dating back decades. Among the papers, he found correspondence between King Alexander and various nobles throughout the kingdom. Most of it seemed to be routine royal business, but some letters caught his attention. They spoke of the collection and preserving the true history of Valdoria. There were references to artifacts and relics that had been hidden away for safekeeping, though the letters didn't specify where these items were located. One particular document made Marcus pause. It was written in King Alexander's own handwriting and was dated just 2 weeks before his death. The letter was addressed to someone referred to only as the Guardian and spoke of ensuring that certain truths about the kingdom's history would be preserved, even if they had to remain hidden for a time. Marcus photographed several of the documents with a small camera he carried for evidence collection, being careful not to disturb anything. As he prepared to leave the hidden room, he heard footsteps in the passage behind him. Someone was coming. He quickly extinguished his lantern and pressed himself against the wall, hoping the darkness would conceal him. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the soft glow of another light source. Marcus gripped his sword, ready to defend himself if necessary. The person entering the room was not who he expected. It was Lady Cordelia, carrying a small electric torch and wearing a long coat over her nightgown. She moved through the room with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. She went directly to one of the shelves and removed several items, placing them in a cloth bag she carried. Marcus watched in silence as she worked. Lady Cordelia was clearly not the victim of mysterious break-ins that she had claimed to be. She was the one removing items from the manor. But why? And why had she called for royal security if she was the one taking things? After several minutes, Lady Cordelia gathered her things and left the room. Marcus waited until he could no longer hear her footsteps before making his own exit. He carefully closed the hidden panel and returned to his post in the main hall, his mind racing with questions about what he had discovered. The next morning brought new complications. Marcus woke early and began his planned search of the grounds. In the gardens behind the manor, he found clear evidence that someone had been digging near an old stone well. The earth was freshly turned, and there were tool marks in the soft soil. When he examined the area more closely, he discovered fragments of what appeared to be very old pottery and metal. Lady Cordelia found him there around 8 o'clock, bringing him coffee and breakfast on a silver tray. She seemed genuinely surprised by his discovery, but Marcus noticed that her eyes lingered on the disturbed earth longer than necessary. "How strange," she said, kneeling beside the excavation. "Who would be digging here, and why?" Marcus studied her face carefully. "That's what I intend to find out, my lady," "Have you noticed any workers or strangers on the property recently?" "No one," she replied quickly. "The groundskeeper was here last week, but he only worked on the front gardens. He had no reason to come back here." As they walked back toward the manor, Marcus decided to test her knowledge. "Lady Cordelia, during our tour yesterday, you mentioned that some books had gone missing from your study. I'm curious about what kind of books they were." She paused, seemingly thinking. "Historical texts, mostly. Some old journals and family records. Nothing that would be valuable to anyone outside the family." "Were any of them related to King Alexander's work?" "I know he was quite interested in Valdorian history." Lady Cordelia's step faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Yes, some of them. My husband spent many hours researching our kingdom's past. He believed it was important to preserve accurate records for future generations." Marcus filed this information away. Her reaction suggested that the connection between the missing books and the hidden room was significant. But he wasn't ready to reveal what he knew just yet. The rest of the morning was spent checking the manor's perimeter and interviewing the household staff. The cook, gardener, and housekeeper all seemed genuinely puzzled by the recent incidents. None of them had seen or heard anything unusual, and all spoke of Lady Cordelia with obvious affection and respect. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, who provided the most interesting information. She was an elderly woman who had worked at the manor for over 20 years, serving both the previous owner and now Lady Cordelia. "It's been different since His Majesty passed," she confided to Marcus as they spoke in the kitchen. "Lady Cordelia spends so much time in that study of hers, sometimes working late into the night, and she's been receiving more visitors lately, though they never stay long." "What kind of visitors?" "Scholarly types, mostly. People with lots of books and papers. They usually meet in the study for an hour or two, then leave. Very quiet, very serious." This information painted a different picture than what Lady Cordelia had presented. Rather than being isolated and victimized, she appeared to be actively engaged in some kind of research or investigation, involving multiple people. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He requested permission to conduct a thorough security inspection of the entire manor, including areas that hadn't been shown to him during the initial tour. Lady Cordelia agreed, though he noticed she seemed nervous about the prospect. Starting in the basement, Marcus worked his way methodically through every room. In the wine cellar, he discovered that several of the wine racks could be moved, revealing additional storage spaces behind them. These areas contained more boxes of documents and artifacts, all carefully labeled and organized. Everything appeared to be related to Valdorian history, but much of it was different from the official records Marcus knew from his training. One box contained maps that showed the kingdom's borders differently than current maps. Another held documents that suggested certain historical events had been recorded incorrectly in official histories. Most intriguing was a collection of letters between King Alexander and various historians and archaeologists, discussing the discovery of artifacts that could change how the world sees Valdoria. As the day wore on, Marcus realized he was uncovering something much larger than a simple case of theft. Lady Cordelia and her late husband appeared to have been involved in a comprehensive effort to collect and preserve historical materials that challenged the accepted version of Valdorian history. The question was whether this was legitimate historical research or something more problematic. The evening brought another revelation. As Marcus maintained his watch in the main hall, he observed Lady Cordelia moving through the manor with purpose. She visited several locations he had discovered during his search, seemingly checking on the hidden materials. Her behavior confirmed that she was fully aware of the concealed items throughout the building. Around 11 o'clock, Marcus heard a vehicle approaching the manor. Through the front windows, he could see headlights winding up the long driveway. Lady Cordelia emerged from her study and went to meet whoever was arriving. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe without being seen. The visitor was a man in his 60s, well-dressed and carrying a leather briefcase. Lady Cordelia greeted him warmly, and they spoke in hushed tones before disappearing into her study. Marcus waited several minutes before making his way to a position where he could hear their conversation. The discussion was fascinating and troubling. The man, whom Lady Cordelia addressed as Professor Hawthorne, was apparently helping her authenticate and catalog the historical materials. They spoke about recent discoveries that supported theories about Valdoria's ancient origins being very different from what was commonly believed. The carbon dating confirms our suspicions, Professor Hawthorne was saying. These artifacts predate the official founding of the kingdom by at least 2 centuries. If this information becomes public, it could completely reshape how historians view our early development. Alexander always believed the official histories were incomplete, Lady Cordelia replied. He spent years collecting evidence to support alternative theories. He wanted to present a complete picture to the academic community, but he died before he could finish the work. And now you're continuing his research? I'm trying to, but it's complicated. Some of these materials were acquired through unofficial channels. Alexander worked with collectors and archaeologists who weren't always concerned with proper legal procedures. If the royal authorities discovered what we have here, there could be serious consequences. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Lady Cordelia was essentially admitting that she and her late husband had been involved in acquiring historical artifacts through potentially illegal means. This put him in an impossible position. As a member of the royal guard, he was sworn to uphold the law, but Lady Cordelia was also under his protection. The conversation continued for another hour, with Professor Hawthorne and Lady Cordelia discussing plans to gradually release their findings through academic papers and carefully planned exhibitions. They spoke about the need for secrecy and the importance of ensuring that all materials were properly documented before any public announcement. When Professor Hawthorne finally left, Marcus returned to his post with a heavy heart. The situation was far more complex than he had anticipated. Lady Cordelia wasn't a victim of theft. She was involved in a sophisticated operation to collect and study historical artifacts, some of which might have been obtained illegally. But her motives appeared to be academic rather than criminal, and her goal seemed to be advancing knowledge rather than personal gain. The following morning brought an unexpected development. Marcus was conducting his morning patrol of the grounds when he discovered that the area around the old well had been disturbed again during the night. Fresh excavation revealed more artifacts, including what appeared to be pieces of ancient jewelry and pottery. As he examined the newly unearthed items, Marcus heard footsteps behind him. Lady Cordelia approached. But this time, she wasn't carrying breakfast or coffee. Instead, she had a serious expression that suggested she knew their careful dance around the truth was coming to an end. "Sergeant Sterling," she said quietly, "I believe it's time we had an honest conversation. We have to start one." "Sergeant Sterling," she said quietly. Marcus straightened and faced her directly. "I believe you're right, my lady. You've discovered things during your investigation, haven't you? Things that I didn't mention when I requested security assistance." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, my lady. I have." Lady Cordelia sighed and sat on a stone bench near the well. For a moment, she looked older than her years, burdened by the weight of secrets she had been carrying alone. "My husband wasn't just interested in history, Sergeant Sterling. He was obsessed with it. He believed that the official records of our kingdom's founding contained significant errors and omissions. He spent the last 10 years of his life collecting evidence to support his theories. And you've been continuing his work? Trying to, yes. But it's been difficult. Some of the materials in his collection were obtained through private dealers and collectors who didn't always follow proper procedures. Alexander planned to donate everything to the Royal Archives eventually, but he wanted to complete his research first. Marcus considered his words carefully. What kind of evidence was he collecting? Artifacts that suggest Valdoria was inhabited much earlier than our histories indicate. Documents that show our early kings had relationships with neighboring kingdoms that were never recorded officially. Maps that indicate our borders were once very different. She paused, looking out across the gardens. Evidence that our entire understanding of this kingdom's origins might be incomplete. And the recent disturbances here at the manor? Lady Cordelia looked embarrassed. "That was me, I'm afraid. I've been trying to locate the final pieces of Alexander's collection. He hid things all over the property, and he didn't leave clear records of where everything was stored. I thought if I called for security, it would provide cover for my searches." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and concern. Lady Cordelia's confession explained many of the mysteries he had encountered, but it also raised serious questions about the legality of her husband's collection and her own actions. My lady, some of the materials I've discovered could be considered stolen artifacts or illegally obtained historical documents. As a member of the Royal Guard, I'm obligated to report such discoveries. Lady Cordelia nodded, seeming to have expected this response. I understand your position, Sergeant. But I hope you'll consider the broader implications of this situation. The historical materials Alexander collected could significantly advance our understanding of Valdoria's past. If they're simply confiscated and locked away, that knowledge might be lost forever. If you consider in the fire, what are you proposing? Give me time to complete the documentation and authentication process. Professor Hawthorne and I are very close to having everything properly catalogued. Once that's done, I'll voluntarily turn everything over to the Royal Archives. The kingdom will have access to all the materials, and the historical record can be corrected appropriately. Marcus found himself in an unprecedented situation. His duty as a royal guard was clear, but the circumstances were anything but straightforward. Lady Cordelia wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. She was a widow trying to complete her husband's scholarly work. The materials she possessed could indeed be valuable to historians and the kingdom as a whole. How much time are we talking about? He asked. 2 weeks, perhaps 3 at most. Professor Hawthorne has arranged for additional experts to assist with the authentication process. We're very close to completion. As Marcus considered his options, he realized that this case would define not just Lady Cordelia's future, but his own as well. The decision he made in the coming days would either uphold the letter of the law or serve the broader interests of historical knowledge and truth. Both paths carried significant risks, and neither guaranteed a clear conscience. The morning sun climbed higher as Marcus Sterling, dedicated servant of the crown, contemplated a choice that would challenge everything he thought he knew about duty, law, and justice. Marcus Sterling stood in the morning sunlight, weighing Lady Cordelia's words against 15 years of unwavering service to the crown. The choice before him seemed impossible. Follow the strict letter of the law, or trust that sometimes the greater good required a more nuanced approach. After several long minutes of silence, he made his decision. 2 weeks, he said finally, but I have conditions. Lady Cordelia's relief was visible, though she tried to maintain her composure. Of course. What do you need? First, I want complete transparency. No more secrets, no more hidden activities. If I'm going to help you protect this collection, I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Agreed. Second, I want to be involved in the documentation process. I need to understand the legal implications of every item in your husband's collection. Professor Hawthorne would welcome the assistance, I'm sure. And third, Marcus paused, meeting her eyes directly. If at any point I determine that this collection poses a threat to the kingdom's security or legitimacy, I will fulfill my duty as a royal guard, regardless of personal consequences. Lady Cordelia nodded solemnly. I wouldn't expect anything less. With this uneasy alliance established, the next phase of Marcus's investigation began. That afternoon, Lady Cordelia led him through the manor more thoroughly than before, revealing every hiding place and secret compartment that contained pieces of her husband's collection. The extent of the hidden materials was staggering. In the library, entire sections of books were hollows containing rolled documents and small artifacts. The wine cellar held not just the boxes Marcus had already discovered, but additional chambers accessed through a complex system of sliding panels. Even Lady Cordelia's private chambers contained concealed safes built into the walls, filled with jewelry, coins, and ornate objects that clearly belonged in museums. Alexander had 20 years to accumulate all of this, Lady Cordelia explained as they catalogued items in her study. He started collecting during his time as a prince, long before he became king. His interest in history was genuine, but I think the secrecy became almost addictive for him. Marcus examined a beautifully crafted golden crown inlaid with precious stones. According to the documentation accompanying it, the piece was supposedly from the pre-Valdorian civilization that Alexander believed had existed in the region centuries before the official founding of the kingdom. Where did he acquire something like this? Marcus asked. That particular piece came from Professor Whitmore at the University of Eastmoor. Alexander funded several archaeological expeditions in exchange for access to significant discoveries. Funded expeditions or funded excavations that weren't officially sanctioned. Lady Cordelia hesitated. Sometimes the line was blurred. Alexander was passionate about uncovering the truth, and he wasn't always patient with the slow pace of official archaeological processes. As they continued their work, Marcus began to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. King Alexander hadn't just been collecting random artifacts. He had been systematically gathering evidence to support a complete rewriting of Valdorian history. The materials suggested that the kingdom had been founded not by brave pioneers settling an empty land, but by conquerors who had displaced an existing civilization. The implications were enormous. If Alexander's theories were correct, many of the founding myths that formed the basis of Valdorian national identity were false. The noble families who traced their lineages back to the original settlers might discover their ancestors were actually invaders who had destroyed an advanced culture. On the third day of their collaboration, Professor Hawthorne returned with 2 additional experts. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an archaeologist from the Royal University, and Dr. James Crawford, a historian specializing in ancient languages. Marcus was surprised to learn that both academics were already familiar with King Alexander's collection and had been working with Lady Cordelia for several months. Your Majesty was very specific about maintaining secrecy, Dr. Mitchell explained during their first meeting. He wanted to ensure that all evidence was thoroughly verified before any public announcements were made. Marcus noticed the respectful way the professors addressed Lady Cordelia and how comfortable they seemed in her presence. This wasn't a recent collaboration. These people had been working together for quite some time. How long have you all known about this collection? He asked. Dr. Crawford answered. King Alexander approached me about 3 years ago. He had questions about some documents he had acquired, and he wanted expert verification of their authenticity. Dr. Mitchell joined the project about 2 years ago when we began finding artifacts that required archaeological analysis. And Professor Hawthorne? I've been involved from the beginning, the older man said. Alexander was my student many years ago. Before he became king, he knew he could trust me to maintain confidentiality while providing honest academic assessment. Marcus realized he was looking at a conspiracy that had been operating for years with the knowledge and participation of some of the kingdom's most respected academics. This wasn't a simple case of a widow trying to complete her husband's work. It was an organized effort to challenge the fundamental historical narrative of their entire kingdom. That evening, as the academic team worked in Lady Cordelia's study, Marcus found himself alone in the hidden room behind King Alexander's portrait. He was reading through more of the late king's personal correspondence when he discovered a letter that made his blood run cold. The letter was addressed to someone identified only as R, and was dated just 1 week before the king's death. In it, Alexander wrote about his growing concern that certain elements within the government had become suspicious of his research. He mentioned receiving warnings to abandon his historical investigations and focus on more conventional royal duties. Most troubling was a paragraph near the end of the letter. I fear that our work may have attracted the attention of those who have the most to lose. If the true history of Valdoria becomes known, the established noble families will not welcome evidence that their ancestors were conquerors rather than pioneers. If something happens to me, ensure that the collection is preserved and that the truth eventually comes to light. Marcus felt a chill as he read these words. King Alexander had died suddenly of what was officially ruled a heart attack, but this letter suggested he had been worried about his safety in the weeks before his death. Was it possible that the king's demise had not been natural? The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise. Marcus was awakened early by the sound of vehicles approaching the manor. From his window, he could see 3 official cars bearing the royal seal. Captain Reynolds was stepping out of the lead vehicle, accompanied by several other members of the royal guard and 2 men in civilian clothes whom Marcus didn't recognize. Lady Cordelia met the group at the front door, maintaining her composure despite the obvious tension of the situation. Marcus quickly dressed and joined them in the main hall, where Captain Reynolds was explaining the purpose of their visit. Lady Cordelia, we've received reports of suspicious activity at the manor. There are concerns about the security of certain historical materials that may be housed here. I'm not sure what you mean, Captain, Lady Cordelia replied calmly. As you can see, Sergeant Sterling has been providing excellent security services. I feel perfectly safe. One of the civilian officials stepped forward. My lady, I am Inspector Morrison from the Royal Cultural Heritage Department. We have reason to believe that this property may contain artifacts or documents that belong to the Crown or should be housed in official repositories. Marcus felt the situation spiraling out of control. Someone had clearly reported their activities. But who? The academic team had been operating in secrecy for years without discovery. What had changed? Captain Reynolds, Marcus interjected. Lady Cordelia requested security assistance due to some minor incidents on the property. I've been conducting a thorough investigation and have found no evidence of any threats to royal cultural heritage. Reynolds studied Marcus carefully. That's good to hear, Sergeant. However, Inspector Morrison has a warrant to search the premises for specific items. I trust you'll cooperate fully. Marcus knew he was trapped. He couldn't refuse a direct order from his superior, but he also couldn't reveal what he had discovered without betraying Lady Cordelia's trust. He decided to buy time and hope that the academics had managed to conceal the most sensitive materials. Of course, sir. What exactly are we looking for? Inspector Morrison consulted a list: documents bearing the royal seal, archaeological artifacts of Valdorian origin, and any materials related to unauthorized historical research conducted by the late King Alexander. Lady Cordelia's face remained impassive, but Marcus noticed her hands trembling slightly. The search warrant was remarkably specific, suggesting that whoever had reported them possessed detailed knowledge of the collection. The search began in the main rooms of the manor, with the royal guards examining obvious locations, while Inspector Morrison and his colleague focused on areas where documents might be hidden. Marcus accompanied them, hoping to steer them away from the most significant hiding places. For the first hour, the search yielded nothing of interest. The academics had apparently done an excellent job of concealing their work. However, Marcus's hopes were dashed when one of the civilian investigators discovered the hidden panel behind King Alexander's portrait. Captain Reynolds, you need to see this, the man called. The discovery of the secret room caused an immediate escalation in the seriousness of the situation. Inspector Morrison ordered a complete search of the manor, including areas that would require dismantling furniture and removing wall panels. It was only a matter of time before they found everything. As the search continued, Marcus found himself in an increasingly difficult position. Captain Reynolds pulled him aside for a private conversation in the manor's front garden. Sterling, I need to know exactly what you've discovered during your time here. This isn't just about some missing artifacts anymore. There are serious questions about the security implications of King Alexander's research activities. Marcus chose his words carefully. Sir, Lady Cordelia has been conducting some historical research in connection with her late husband's interests. I've seen documents and artifacts that appear to be related to early Valdorian history. How significant are these materials? They appear to challenge some commonly accepted historical facts about the kingdom's founding. Reynolds's expression darkened. That's what we were afraid of. Sterling, this situation is more complex than you realize. There are concerns at the highest levels of government about the potential impact of King Alexander's research. What do you mean? I mean that if certain theories about our kingdom's origins become widely accepted, it could destabilize the entire foundation of our current political system. The noble families, the royal succession, the legal basis for land ownership. All of it could be called into question. Quote, Marcus felt a chill as he realized the true stakes of the situation. This wasn't just about historical accuracy. It was about political power and the stability of the kingdom itself. Sir, what exactly are my orders? For now, continue to cooperate with the search and document everything you observe. But Sterling, Reynolds paused, lowering his voice. I want you to understand that this case may require you to make some difficult choices about where your loyalty lies. The search of Thornwick Manor continued through the afternoon, yielding an increasingly impressive collection of historical materials. The investigators found documents, artifacts, maps, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic historical research spanning multiple years. Dr. Mitchell, Professor Hawthorne, and Dr. Crawford were questioned extensively about their involvement. Lady Cordelia maintained her dignity throughout the process, answering questions honestly but offering no more information than was directly requested. Marcus observed her behavior with growing respect. She was clearly terrified, but refused to let that fear overwhelm her composure. As evening approached, Inspector Morrison announced that he was seizing the entire collection pending a full investigation. Trucks arrived to transport the materials to secure storage facilities in the capital, and the academic team was ordered to suspend all research activities. Lady Cordelia, Inspector Morrison said formally, "You are not under arrest at this time, but you are required to remain available for further questioning. Do not leave the kingdom without permission from my department." After the officials departed, taking years of careful research with them, Marcus found himself alone with Lady Cordelia in the now empty manor. She sat in her study, staring at the spaces where her husband's life work had been stored just hours earlier. "I should have expected this," she said quietly. "Alexander always worried that powerful people would try to suppress his research. Who do you think reported us? It could have been anyone. The academic community isn't as discreet as people assume, and there are those who have significant investments in maintaining the current version of history." Marcus sat across from her, wrestling with his own conflicted feelings about the day's events. "Lady Cordelia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Did your husband die naturally?" The question hung in the air between them for several long moments before Lady Cordelia responded. "I don't know," she said finally. "The official cause of death was heart failure, and Alexander did have some heart problems. But the timing was suspicious. He was planning to present his findings to the Royal Historical Society within a month. He had been receiving pressure to abandon his research, and he was becoming increasingly concerned about threats. What kind of threats? Anonymous letters warning him to stop his historical investigations, phone calls in the middle of the night, people following him when he traveled to meet with other researchers. Lady Cordelia's voice became stronger as she continued. Alexander was many things, but he wasn't paranoid. If he believed someone was trying to intimidate him, it was probably true. Marcus felt the weight of implications settling over him. If King Alexander had indeed been murdered to prevent the release of his historical research, then Lady Cordelia could be in danger as well. And now Marcus himself was involved in a situation that was far more dangerous than he had initially realized. "What happens now?" he asked. "I suppose that depends on you, Sergeant Sterling. You're the only person who has seen the complete scope of Alexander's collection and understands its significance. The question is, what you choose to do with that knowledge." Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds where he had first discovered evidence of the hidden excavations. Everything had seemed so simple just a week ago. Now he found himself at the center of a conspiracy that could reshape the kingdom's understanding of its own origins. "There's something else you should know," Lady Cordelia said, joining him at the window. "The collection that was seized today wasn't complete. Alexander was too careful to keep everything in one location." Marcus turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" "He maintained additional caches of materials in other locations. Secret depositories that he shared only with me. The most significant pieces of evidence, the ones that would definitively prove his theories about Valdoria's true origins, are still hidden." "And where? That's the question, isn't it? Alexander left me clues, but they're cryptic and difficult to interpret. He was always concerned that if something happened to him, others would try to suppress his work. So he made sure that the most important evidence would be nearly impossible to find without solving a series of puzzles he designed." Marcus realized that the events of the day had not ended the mystery. They had only revealed how much deeper it actually went. Lady Cordelia possessed knowledge of additional hidden materials that could be even more significant than what had been discovered at the manor. "How much time do you think we have before they come back?" "Not much." Inspector Morrison seemed to believe that today's seizure was comprehensive, but it won't take long for the experts examining the materials to realize that key pieces are missing. Marcus made another decision that would have far-reaching consequences. "Then, we need to find the rest of your husband's collection before they do." Lady Cordelia smiled for the first time since the search had begun. "Sergeant Sterling, Are you suggesting that we embark on a treasure hunt for stolen historical artifacts while evading government investigators? I'm suggesting that we complete King Alexander's work and ensure that the truth about Valdorian history is preserved, regardless of who might want to suppress it. As the sun set over Thornwick Manor, Marcus Sterling found himself committed to a course of action that would test not only his skills as a royal guard, but his understanding of honor, duty, and justice. The simple security assignment that had brought him to the manor had evolved into something that could change the kingdom forever. The next morning, Lady Cordelia showed Marcus the first of her husband's clues. It was a letter written in Alexander's handwriting but composed entirely of seemingly random historical references and geographical descriptions. To most people, it would appear to be the notes of an absent-minded scholar, but Lady Cordelia believed it was a carefully constructed map leading to one of the hidden caches. Alexander loved puzzles and codes, she explained as they studied the document in her study. He said it was a skill that served him well in both scholarly research and royal diplomacy. This letter refers to the place where the ancient waters meet the King's Road, and mentions 7 stones marking the boundary between old and new. Marcus examined the references carefully. His training had included extensive study of Valdorian geography and landmarks, knowledge that might prove valuable in interpreting the clues. The ancient waters could refer to the old riverbed near Millbrook, about 20 miles east of here. The river was diverted during construction of the King's Highway, about 50 years ago. And the 7 stones? There's an old boundary marker near Millbrook, 7 standing stones that supposedly marked the edge of settled territory in ancient times. Most people assume they're just old property markers, but if your husband was right about pre-Valdorian civilization, they could be much more significant, Lady Cordelia finished. Alexander always said that the most important historical evidence was hidden in plain sight, dismissed by people who didn't understand its true meaning. The prospect of leaving the manor to search for hidden caches presented new challenges. Marcus was still officially assigned to provide security for Lady Cordelia, but traveling around the countryside looking for buried artifacts would be difficult to explain if they encountered other royal guards or government officials. "We'll need a cover story," Marcus said as they planned their expedition. "Something that explains why we're visiting historical sites around the kingdom. What if we say, 'I'm researching locations for a memorial to Alexander'? It would be natural for me to want to visit places that were significant to him." Marcus nodded. The story was plausible and would allow them to move freely while conducting their search, but he was also aware that every moment they spent away from the manor increased the risk of discovery. That afternoon, they set out for Millbrook in Lady Cordelia's private car, a modest sedan that would attract less attention than an official vehicle. The drive through the countryside was beautiful, with autumn colors painting the hills and valleys in shades of gold and red. Under different circumstances, Marcus might have enjoyed the peaceful journey. The ancient boundary stones were exactly where Marcus remembered them, standing in a rough circle on a hilltop overlooking the old riverbed. Each stone was about 8 feet tall and carved with symbols that had been worn smooth by centuries of weather. Local folklore attributed them to early Valdorian settlers, but they had never been properly studied by archaeologists. Lady Cordelia walked among the stones, consulting her husband's letter and looking for additional clues. Marcus examined the symbols on each stone, trying to determine if any of them matched references in Alexander's writings. "Here," Lady Cordelia called from the center of the circle. "The letter mentions where the 7th guardian looks toward the sunrise. This stone faces due east, and there's something different about the carving near its base." Marcus joined her and saw what she had noticed. While most of the stones bore only abstract symbols, this one had what appeared to be a more deliberate design carved near ground level. The carving showed a hand pointing toward a cluster of symbols that could represent either stars or markers on a map. Alexander believed these stones were much older than anyone realized, Lady Cordelia said as they studied the carving. He thought they might be markers left by the pre-Valdorian civilization, pointing toward important locations. Following the direction indicated by the carved hand, they walked east from the stone circle toward a wooded area near the old riverbed. The terrain was rough and overgrown, making progress slow and difficult. After about half a mile, they reached what appeared to be the remains of an ancient foundation, barely visible under decades of accumulated soil and vegetation. "This has to be it," Lady Cordelia said, excitement evident in her voice. Alexander wrote about foundations of the forgotten ones in several of his letters. Marcus began clearing away debris from what appeared to be a stone structure partially buried in the hillside. As they worked, the outlines of a small building became visible. The construction was unlike anything Marcus had seen in Valdorian architecture, with carefully fitted stones that required no mortar and drainage systems that were surprisingly sophisticated. Near the center of the structure, they found what Alexander had hidden. A waterproof container buried beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones contained documents, photographs, and several small artifacts. Among them was a journal in Alexander's handwriting that detailed his theories about the pre-Valdorian civilization and provided evidence for their advanced knowledge of engineering and astronomy. Most significantly, the cache contained carbon dating results that confirmed the age of various artifacts at thousands of years older than the official founding of Valdoria. There were also photographs of wall paintings discovered in hidden caves that showed the arrival of the Valdorian settlers and their conflicts with the existing population. "This is incredible," Marcus said as he examined photographs of cave paintings that appeared to show battles between two distinct groups of people. "If these images are authentic, they provide visual evidence of exactly what your husband theorized." Alexander spent 2 years documenting those caves before they were sealed by a landslide. These photographs may be the only remaining record of what he found there. As they studied the materials, Marcus began to understand the true magnitude of what they had discovered. This wasn't just academic research. It was evidence that the foundational myths of their kingdom were based on a deliberate suppression of historical truth. The implications for contemporary politics and social structures would be enormous. But their success in finding the first cache also brought new dangers. As they packed the materials for transport back to the manor, Marcus noticed movement in the trees nearby. Someone was watching them. "Lady Cordelia, we need to leave immediately," he said quietly, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. She looked around, sensing the tension in his voice. "What's wrong? We're not alone out here." As they quickly gathered their discoveries and prepared to return to the car, Marcus counted at least 3 separate positions where observers were concealed. Their expedition had been discovered, and whoever was watching them had not revealed themselves for friendly reasons. The race to uncover the truth about Valdoria's hidden history had become significantly more dangerous. Marcus moved carefully through the underbrush, positioning himself between Lady Cordelia and the concealed watchers. His years of military training had taught him to read dangerous situations, and everything about their current predicament screamed immediate threat. The observers weren't casual hikers or curious locals. Their positioning was too strategic, their concealment too professional. "Stay close to me and move slowly toward the car," he whispered to Lady Cordelia. "Don't look around or make any sudden movements." They began walking back along the path they had taken to reach the ancient foundation. But Marcus knew they wouldn't reach safety easily. The Watchers had allowed them to discover and collect the hidden materials, which meant they wanted to know what Lady Cordelia and her husband had found. That suggested interrogation rather than simple observation. About halfway back to their vehicle, Marcus heard the sound he had been dreading. Footsteps moving to intercept them. 3 men emerged from the trees ahead, blocking their path. They wore dark clothing and had the bearing of professional security operatives rather than government officials. "Lady Cordelia," the lead man said politely, "we'd like to have a conversation with you about your recent research activities." Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between the men and Lady Cordelia. "Identify yourselves and state your business." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid that's not how this works, Sergeant Sterling. You're both coming with us for a discussion about matters of national security." Marcus realized they knew exactly who he was, which meant this confrontation had been planned in advance. Someone had been tracking their movements and had anticipated their search for additional hidden materials. "Lady Cordelia is under the protection of the Royal Guard," Marcus said firmly. "If you have official business with her, present your credentials and go through proper channels." "Official channels become complicated when dealing with matters that could destabilize the kingdom," the man replied. "Some conversations are better conducted privately." Marcus's hand moved toward his weapon, but he stopped when he noticed the other men had already drawn theirs. He was outnumbered and outpositioned. With Lady Cordelia behind him and no cover available, fighting would only ensure that both of them were killed. "What do you want?" Lady Cordelia asked, stepping out from behind Marcus. "We want to know everything you and your late husband discovered about Valdorian history. We want to know where the remaining materials are hidden. And we want your assurance that this research will be permanently discontinued. And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to take more direct action to protect the kingdom's interests." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. These men were threatening Lady Cordelia, while hiding behind claims of patriotic duty. But he also recognized that their situation was desperate. Without reinforcements or backup, his options were severely limited. "Who sent you?" he demanded. "People who understand that some truths are too dangerous to be revealed," the lead man replied. King Alexander learned that lesson too late. The implication was clear and chilling. These men were confirming that King Alexander had been murdered to prevent the release of his historical research. Lady Cordelia gasped, and Marcus felt his resolve hardening into something approaching fury. "You killed him," Lady Cordelia whispered. King Alexander chose to ignore repeated warnings about the consequences of his research. His death was regrettable but necessary to prevent social chaos. Marcus made a decision that went against every tactical instinct he possessed. Rather than submit to capture and interrogation, he chose to fight. But instead of going for his weapon, he did something unexpected. He activated the emergency beacon every royal guard carried, sending a distress signal that would bring immediate response from the nearest garrison. The move surprised their captors, buying Marcus the seconds he needed to tackle the lead man and create chaos that would give Lady Cordelia a chance to escape. The fight was brief but violent, with Marcus using his military training to maximum advantage in close combat. However, the odds were still against him. As he struggled with one assailant, another moved to capture Lady Cordelia. Marcus fought desperately to reach her. But a blow to his head left him dazed and struggling to maintain consciousness. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. The Royal Guard distress signal had been received, and help was arriving faster than anyone had anticipated. The mysterious operatives realized they had lost the initiative and began retreating into the woods, but not before their leader delivered a final warning. "This isn't over, Lady Cordelia. The materials your husband collected represent a threat to everything our kingdom is built upon. We will retrieve them, one way or another." As the men disappeared into the forest, Marcus struggled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut above his left eye. Lady Cordelia was shaken but unharmed, clutching the bag containing the materials they had discovered at the ancient site. The arriving royal guards were led by Lieutenant Anderson, a capable officer whom Marcus had worked with on previous assignments. After quickly securing the area and ensuring no immediate threats remained, Anderson demanded an explanation for the distress signal. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't explain why he and Lady Cordelia had been at the archaeological site without revealing their search for King Alexander's hidden materials. But he also couldn't hide the fact that they had been attacked by professional operatives who seemed to have government connections. "Sir, Lady Cordelia and I were visiting historical sites related to her late husband's interests when we were confronted by armed men claiming to represent national security interests. They made threats against Lady Cordelia and suggested they were responsible for King Alexander's death." Lieutenant Anderson's expression grew serious. "Did they identify themselves or present any official credentials?" "No, sir. They refused to provide identification and made it clear they intended to operate outside official channels." Anderson ordered his men to search the surrounding area for the attackers, though Marcus suspected they would find nothing. The operatives had been too professional to leave obvious traces, and they had probably extracted from the area as soon as the Royal Guard vehicles arrived. "Lady Cordelia, are you injured?" Anderson asked. "No, Lieutenant, but I'm concerned about what these men represent. They claimed to be acting in the kingdom's interests, but they were clearly operating without legal authority." Anderson radioed back to headquarters, reporting the incident and requesting additional security for both Lady Cordelia and Marcus. Within an hour, the situation had escalated to involve senior Royal Guard leadership and government security officials. Captain Reynolds arrived at the scene as the sun was beginning to set, accompanied by the same civilian investigators who had searched Thornwick Manor. Marcus realized that the day's events had forced a confrontation between different factions within the government itself. "Sergeant Sterling, explain to me exactly what happened here," Reynolds ordered. Marcus gave a carefully factual account of the attack, emphasizing the threats made against Lady Cordelia and the attackers' claims about King Alexander's death. He avoided mentioning the specific materials they had discovered, but he made it clear that someone was willing to use violence to suppress historical research. Inspector Morrison examined the site where the confrontation had occurred, collecting evidence and documenting the scene. His investigation confirmed that multiple armed individuals had been present and that a significant struggle had taken place. "Lady Cordelia," Morrison said, "I need to ask you directly. Are there additional materials related to your husband's research that we haven't recovered?" Lady Cordelia looked at Marcus before answering. "Inspector, after today's events, I'm concerned that certain parties may be willing to use violence to suppress my husband's work. Before I provide any additional information, I want guarantees about my safety and assurances that his research will be handled appropriately." Morrison nodded grimly. "I think recent events have made it clear that this situation involves more than just archaeological materials. We're dealing with a security matter that may involve threats to members of the royal family." The drive back to Thornwick Manor took place in a convoy of official vehicles, with royal guards providing security and government investigators ensuring that no further attacks occurred. Marcus found himself riding with Captain Reynolds, who was clearly troubled by the day's developments. "Sterling, I need to know where your loyalties lie in this situation," Reynolds said bluntly. "Sir, my loyalty is to the crown and to the protection of Valdorian citizens. If that means ensuring Lady Cordelia's safety while she completes legitimate historical research, then that's where my duty lies. Even if that research could destabilize the kingdom?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. "Sir, I believe the greater threat to the kingdom comes from those who are willing to commit murder and use violence to suppress the truth. Whatever King Alexander discovered, it's important enough that some people consider it worth killing for." Reynolds was quiet for several minutes before responding. "The situation is more complex than you realize, Sterling. There are factions within the government who believe that certain historical truths could undermine the legal and social foundations of our entire political system, and other factions who believe that suppressing the truth is ultimately more dangerous than revealing it. Regardless of short-term consequences, Marcus realized he was witnessing a larger conflict that had been building within the government for some time. The attack on Lady Cordelia wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of an ongoing struggle over how to handle King Alexander's discoveries. Back at the manor, security was immediately increased with royal guards stationed around the property and government investigators establishing a temporary command center in the main hall. Lady Cordelia was questioned extensively about the materials they had discovered and about additional locations where her husband might have hidden artifacts. Under the changed circumstances, she decided to cooperate fully with the official investigation. That evening, she showed Inspector Morrison and his team the complete contents of the cache they had discovered at the ancient boundary stones. The photographs of cave paintings and the carbon dating results caused immediate concern among the investigators. "If these findings are accurate," Dr. Mitchell said as she examined the materials, "they represent the most significant archaeological discovery in Valdorian history. The implications for our understanding of the kingdom's origins would be revolutionary." Inspector Morrison was more focused on the security aspects. "The question is whether revolutionary historical discoveries are worth the risk of social and political upheaval. There are legitimate concerns about how this information might be used by groups seeking to challenge the current government." Marcus listened to these discussions with growing appreciation for the complexity of the situation. Lady Cordelia and her husband hadn't just been conducting historical research. They had been uncovering evidence that could fundamentally change how Valdorians understood their national identity. Late that evening, Marcus found Lady Cordelia in her study, staring out the window at the Royal Guard patrols moving around the manor grounds. The events of the day had clearly taken a toll on her, but she seemed more determined than defeated. "Do you regret asking me for security assistance?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "No, Sergeant Sterling. If you hadn't been here, I would never have survived this long. Alexander's research was too important to die with him, even if completing it puts us both at risk." "What happens now?" That depends on which faction within the government ultimately prevails. If the people who attacked us today gain control of the investigation, Alexander's work will be buried forever, and the truth about our kingdom's history will remain hidden. Marcus moved to stand beside her at the window. And if the other side wins, then we'll have the opportunity to complete the documentation process and present Alexander's findings to the academic community and the public. The decision about what to do with that information can then be made openly, rather than in secret. Over the next several days, the investigation intensified. More royal guards arrived to provide security, and additional government officials became involved in reviewing the materials that had been discovered. The hidden room at the manor was thoroughly documented, and teams of experts began the process of authenticating and cataloging every item in the collection. Marcus found himself caught between his duty as a royal guard and his growing conviction that Lady Cordelia's work represented something larger than personal historical interest. The more he learned about King Alexander's research, the more convinced he became that the late king had uncovered evidence of systematic historical deception that had lasted for centuries. The breakthrough came when Professor Hawthorne discovered a pattern in King Alexander's correspondence that revealed the locations of 2 additional caches of materials. Unlike the site at the Boundary Stones, these locations were on government property, which meant official permission would be required to conduct excavations. Inspector Morrison faced a difficult decision. Authorizing archaeological work on government land, based on the clues left by a dead king, would signal official support for research that many powerful people wanted suppressed. But failing to investigate could mean losing evidence of significant historical importance. The decision was ultimately made at the highest levels of government. Marcus learned about the outcome when Captain Reynolds summoned him for a private meeting in the manor's library. Sterling, I've received orders from the palace itself. The investigation into King Alexander's research has been elevated to a matter of national importance. You're being reassigned to lead security for a joint archaeological expedition that will attempt to locate and document all remaining materials. Marcus felt relief and apprehension in equal measure. What about the people who attacked us? The ones who claim to be acting in the kingdom's interests? Reynolds's expression hardened. Internal security is handling that matter. Several arrests have been made, and it appears that a rogue faction within the intelligence services was operating without authorization. They believed they were protecting the kingdom, but they were actually undermining the rule of law. The archaeological expedition began the following week with a team that included Dr. Mitchell, Professor Hawthorne, Inspector Morrison, and a full security detail led by Marcus. Lady Cordelia served as a consultant, providing expertise about her husband's methods and helping to interpret his cryptic clues. The first additional cache was located beneath an old monument in the capital city. The excavation required careful coordination with city authorities and attracted significant public attention. When news broke that archaeologists were conducting investigations related to King Alexander's historical research, speculation began about what had been discovered. The materials found at the monument site were even more significant than those discovered earlier. They included documentation of contacts between King Alexander and international historians who had found similar evidence of historical suppression in other kingdoms. The late king had apparently been part of a broader scholarly network dedicated to uncovering suppressed historical truths. Most importantly, the cache contained detailed maps showing the locations of ancient settlements that predated Valdorian colonization by centuries. These maps were accompanied by surveys and archaeological reports that provided definitive proof of the advanced civilization that had existed in the region before the arrival of the Valdorian settlers. The final cache required the most dangerous excavation. It was located in a cave system in the mountains near the border, in an area that had been sealed by government order decades earlier. The official reason for the closure was geological instability, but King Alexander's notes suggested the real motive was to prevent access to cave paintings and artifacts that contradicted official histories. The expedition to the mountain caves took place under heavy security, with royal guards providing protection against both natural hazards and potential human threats. Marcus led the security team, while Dr. Mitchell supervised the archaeological work. Inside the caves, they found exactly what King Alexander's research had predicted: extensive wall paintings that told the story of contact between the indigenous population and Valdorian colonists. The images showed not peaceful settlement, but conquest and displacement. They depicted battles, the destruction of cities, and the systematic suppression of the existing culture. But the most significant discovery was a chamber deep within the cave system that contained written records in the ancient language of the pre-Valdorian civilization. Dr. Crawford, working with translation software and reference materials, was able to decode enough of the text to confirm its historical importance. "These are administrative records," he explained to the expedition team. "They document trade relationships with neighboring kingdoms, astronomical observations, and legal proceedings. They prove that the pre-Valdorian civilization was not only advanced but was integrated into a network of international relationships that lasted for centuries." Lady Cordelia stood among the ancient writings with tears in her eyes. Alexander was right about everything. This civilization wasn't primitive or isolated. They were sophisticated people with their own culture, their own achievements, and their own right to be remembered. The completion of the archaeological work marked the end of Marcus's extraordinary assignment, but the beginning of a new chapter in Valdorian history. The evidence collected through King Alexander's research and the subsequent expedition was comprehensive enough to fundamentally revise understanding of the kingdom's origins. Inspector Morrison faced the challenging task of presenting the findings to government leadership and the public. The materials were too significant to suppress, but their implications were exactly as troubling as the original opponents had feared. The solution ultimately adopted was a gradual revelation process that allowed Valdorian society to absorb the new historical information without sudden social upheaval. Academic papers were published, detailing the archaeological findings, followed by museum exhibitions that presented the evidence in educational rather than political contexts. Lady Cordelia played a central role in this process, working with historians and educators to ensure that her husband's research contributed to greater understanding rather than social division. She established a foundation dedicated to historical research and archaeology, ensuring that future discoveries would be handled openly and professionally. Marcus returned to his regular duties with the Royal Guard, but his experience at Thornwick Manor had changed his understanding of duty and service. He had learned that sometimes protecting the kingdom required challenging official narratives and defending the right to seek truth, even when that truth was inconvenient for those in power. Several months later, Marcus received an invitation to attend the dedication of the King Alexander Memorial Archives, a new institution that would house the materials discovered during the investigation. Lady Cordelia had decided to donate her husband's entire collection to ensure that future researchers would have access to the evidence of Valdoria's hidden history. At the dedication ceremony, she spoke about the importance of understanding the past honestly, regardless of how that understanding might complicate contemporary perspectives. She emphasized that acknowledging historical injustices didn't diminish the achievements of modern Valdoria, but rather provided a foundation for building a more just and honest society. Marcus stood among the audience, wearing his Royal Guard uniform and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple security assignment. He had entered Lady Cordelia's service believing that duty meant following orders without question. He had learned that true duty sometimes required questioning authority in service of larger principles. The investigation had revealed that King Alexander hadn't died naturally, but had been murdered by those who feared the implications of his research. The perpetrators had been arrested and tried, though the full extent of the conspiracy was never completely revealed. What mattered was that the truth about Valdorian history was now part of the public record, available for anyone who wanted to understand their kingdom's complete heritage. Lady Cordelia continued her work as a historian and educator, becoming a respected voice for transparency and historical honesty. She never remarried, dedicating herself instead to ensuring that her husband's legacy contributed to greater understanding and justice. Marcus occasionally visited her at her new home in the capital, where she had moved to be closer to the archives and the university. Their conversations often returned to the events at Thornwick Manor and the lessons they had learned about courage, truth, and the responsibilities that come with knowledge. "Do you think Alexander would be pleased with how everything turned out?" Marcus asked during one such visit. Lady Cordelia smiled, looking out over the city where the new archives building stood as a testament to the power of persistent inquiry. "I think he would be proud that the truth finally emerged, even though it took longer than he hoped. He always believed that honest history was essential for a just society." Marcus nodded, understanding that their work at Thornwick Manor had been about more than recovering hidden artifacts. It had been about defending the principle that societies are strengthened, not weakened, by honest examination of their past. The royal guard who had broken into Lady Cordelia's estate to recover hidden relics had indeed found treasure, but not the kind he had originally expected. Instead of gold or jewels, he had discovered something far more valuable: the truth about his kingdom's origins, and his own capacity to choose principle over convenience when faced with difficult moral choices. Years later, when Marcus told the story to young royal guards beginning their service, he emphasized that their duty was not just to protect the crown or follow orders, but to serve justice and truth in whatever form they might take. The security of the kingdom, he had learned, ultimately depended not on suppressing uncomfortable truths, but on having the courage to face them honestly. The hidden chamber behind King Alexander's portrait had been permanently sealed, but its contents now resided in the bright halls of the Memorial Archives, where scholars and citizens alike could study the complete history of their remarkable kingdom. Lady Cordelia had successfully completed her husband's work, ensuring that the voices of the forgotten civilization would finally be heard after centuries of silence. In the end, the story of the royal guard who broke into Thornwick Manor became a reminder that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from following established procedures, but from having the wisdom to recognize when those procedures serve political convenience rather than truth and justice. Marcus Sterling had entered the manor as a loyal servant of the crown. He had emerged as a defender of something larger and more enduring than any single government or political system. The truth, once hidden in secret chambers and buried caches, now stood in the light of day, a testament to the persistence of those who believe that understanding the past honestly is essential for building a better future.